From an altitude of almost 3,000 meters, we could barely make out the convoys sailing across the calm Mediterranean Sea. A pale blue haze covered the sea surface, obscuring the outlines of the ships. After only 20 minutes of flight from Trapani, the island behind us became a dirty brown blur, and we saw the first ships of Clark's invasion fleet heading for Salerno. 9 tank landing craft were coming in 2 Kielvator columns, guarded on the flank by 3 patrol ships. The pilot shook the wings of our aircraft C-47 and turned off the course of the convoy, as he had already had bitter experience, being a participant in the operation of airborne landing in Sicily. That same day at 9 a.m. we left the 2nd Corps command post and loaded our luggage onto the aircraft. Before heading for England, we first visited the United States, covering a total route of 18,500 kilometers. Patton provided us with his aeroplane to Algiers. We were to make a detour through Carthage, where Eisenhower had deployed his forward command center to direct the invasion of Italy. Lewis Bridge was to wait for us in Algiers with the other officers I had selected in the corps to go to England. Keane and Hansen were traveling with me to the United States. There I hoped to complete my staff in preparation for the invasion of France. The night before, the choir had sung us the 2nd Corps battle song. Each stanza was dedicated to a different phase of the fighting, and as a whole the song glorified the Corps' victories in the Mediterranean. The verses were immodest and boastful. But such was the 2nd Corps itself, which was no different from any other unit in the American Army. I had hoped to leave discreetly the next morning to avoid the send-off ceremony. However, an honor guard was already standing along the gravel road that ran from our camp through the vineyards to the coastal road. The vines, grown in soil abundantly fertilized by several generations of people, sagged under the weight of grape brushes. If such grapes were eaten without first being thoroughly washed, violent attacks of dysentery would result. If the soldiers of the Guard of Honor quietly ate grapes, as I once did, their memories of my departure were less pleasant than mine. Although I was strongly anxious to begin preparations for an invasion across the Channel, parting with the Corps was a burdensome event. Both first love and first independent command under combat conditions linger long in the memory. After spending 7 unforgettable months with the 2nd Corps, I felt like an insecure young man leaving home to forge his own path in life. As the P-47 aircraft took to the air, I cast one last glance at the Corps command post, where a huge sign remained of the last location of the Corps headquarters. The 7th Army had objected when the sappers of the 2nd Corps had erected such a grand sign. Now all that remains is to illuminate it with a searchlight at night, they said, to show the German Air Force where you are. In the end, however, pride triumphed over caution, and the huge signpost survived. The enemy, we objected, could find far more important targets to bombard than a Corps command post at rest. We landed at an aerodrome near Carthage, and then drove past the ruins to a group of villas perched on a high hill overlooking the sea. It was in these villas, owned by wealthy Europeans who had settled in colonial North Africa, that the higher headquarters were located, with running water and sewerage facilities at their disposal. Eisenhower did not return for a second breakfast until 2 p.m. He looked tired and worried. "Badoglio is messing things up," he explained. "We've just cancelled the Ridgeway airborne landing in the Rome area." Eisenhower was referring to the Italian surrender agreement and his plan to land an airborne division in the vicinity of Rome. The joint surrender declaration was to be broadcast by radio at 6 p.m., 30 in the evening, and at 3 o'clock, 30 min. The next morning, Clark would land at Salerno. Eisenhower was only a few hours away from speaking on the radio, but he had no confidence that Badoglio would honor the surrender agreement by speaking simultaneously on the radio in Rome. If he did not speak on the radio at the same time as Eisenhower, then the Germans would seize the Italian broadcasting stations and qualify our statement as a bluff. Badoglio had broken a prior agreement in the morning by asking Ike by radio from Rome to wait to announce Italy's surrender until after the Allied landings. Eisenhower replied bluntly, "I will declare an armistice at the time we agreed upon," he stated. "If you or any connection of your armed forces does not fulfill the terms of the armistice, I will publish on the radio the full text of this document." At the same time, Eisenhower, with great reluctance, cancelled the landing of Ridgway's 82nd Division in the vicinity of Rome. Badoglio advised that the Italian government would not accept responsibility for the division's safety. Eisenhower also ordered Brigadier General Maxwell Taylor, a representative of Allied headquarters who was in Rome on an illegal mission, to return immediately to Carthage. Taylor's job was to ensure that aircraft carrying men and equipment from the 82nd Division landed unhindered at airfields around Rome. This sudden change on the eve of the landing of Clark's troops had the effect of putting the 82nd Division out of action when we desperately needed it. There was no longer time, as originally intended, to throw the 82nd Division into Capua to support the landing at Salerno. As a result, the 82nd Division almost became the proverbial nail in the horseshoe, at the most critical moment when the landing force in the Salerno area was on the brink of death. Mike spent the rest of the day at Carthage. When I had to leave for Algiers, there was still no word from Rome from Badoglio that he would fulfill his promise and announce to the Italian people at a fixed time the surrender of Italy. We left Carthage in the afternoon and travelled along the North African coast to Allied headquarters in Algiers. Keane and I dozed off in the improvised padded seats of our plane. Behind us, the Mediterranean Sea darkened into twilight and concealed Mark Clark's army as it approached the landing points on the Italian boot. At 18 HRs, 34 min, Hansen jumped out of the cockpit with headphones in his hand. "General Eisenhower has just come on the radio and announced the surrender of Italy," he said. "Would you like to hear the final part of the program?" The pilot, unaware of the negotiations with Italy, accidentally tuned into the wave on which Eisenhower's announcement was being broadcast. He bounced excitedly in his seat when he heard Eisenhower's voice. I put on my headphones and asked the pilot to go over the entire waveband of the radio. However, there was no hint of Badoglio speaking on the radio. Only after landing in Algiers did I learn that Badoglio had overcome his fear and announced Italy's surrender 45 minutes later than the stipulated time. At 7 p.m. 15 min, in the evening he read the declaration of unconditional surrender and called on the radio for the Italian people to raise arms against their German ally. That same evening the king and his government flew to the Allies in search of refuge. In Algiers, I met with Bedell Smith. He looked tired and anxious as he awaited news of the surrender of the Italian fleet. For further Allied operations in the Mediterranean, it was important that the strong Italian surface fleet did not fall into the hands of the Germans. We hoped that it would not be necessary to sink the Italian fleet, as was sunk French in Toulon. There is no doubt that the situation at sea has improved considerably since 1940, when the British were forced to shell the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir to prevent the Germans from using it in accordance with the terms of surrender of the Vichy government. The Allies were now able to mercilessly pursue German submarines in the North Atlantic Ocean, and in general Allied power at sea was increasing at a dizzying rate. Nevertheless, the Italian fleet could create significant difficulties for us if it fell into the hands of the Germans. In that case, the Allies would have needed to deploy some naval forces in the Mediterranean to block the Italian fleet. And in 1943, the Allies could use naval forces with great success elsewhere, immediately following Eisenhower's announcement of Italy's unconditional surrender. Admiral Cunningham ordered the Italian fleet by radio to proceed to Allied ports in accordance with the terms of the armistice. That same day in the evening, the Italian fleet anchored at Taranto, La Spezia and Genoa and headed for Malta during the night. At dawn on 9 September, the Italian flagship battleship Roma was spotted by German reconnaissance aircraft off the coast of Sardinia. In the afternoon, the battleship was attacked by 15 Ju-88 bombers. The commander of the Italian fleet sank with his ship, whose guns were pointed against the former Allies' aircraft. On 10 September 1943, Admiral Cunningham reported to the Naval Ministry in London, "Your Lordships, I am pleased to inform you that the Italian war fleet is anchored under the protection of the fortress guns of Malta." Cunningham had a right to be proud. For 3 strenuous years he had kept open the sea lanes across the Mediterranean to Malta and the Suez Canal, although Nazi air action had resulted in the deaths of hundreds of British sailors. Only a year had passed since October 1942, when Montgomery managed at El Alamein to change the course of the war in this theatre in favour of the Allies. Now 12 months later, not only had the British achieved control of the Mediterranean, but Montgomery's 8th Army was already on the Apennine Peninsula, moving up the Italian boot. For a time, Eisenhower had doubted whether Mark Clark's troops should have been informed of Italy's surrender before they landed on the mainland. He knew that if the troops did not expect to meet resistance, the Germans might take them by surprise. Nevertheless, Eisenhower asked himself, Did we have the right to withhold this news from the troops when the Italians had promised to fight on our side? In the end, Eisenhower decided that we could not do so. He preferred to risk some relaxation of the troops' vigilance, but give them the pleasant news. Only months later did I learn that the situation was much worse than we had anticipated that night in Algiers. Clark's troops had thrown off all caution before the Germans struck. Many of them were so confident of a favourable outcome of the landing that the unexpected enemy resistance almost led to panic in some units. In Italy, the Germans could not be taken by surprise. For the same reasons that guided Eisenhower in choosing the landing site in the Salerno area, the enemy decided that this is where Clark's troops will land. The Germans mined the coast, covered it with wire barriers, fortified themselves in key positions and concentrated near Naples' additional reserves. In the end, Eisenhower was forced to throw all the aviation of the Mediterranean theatre of operations to help Clark's troops to hold on to an unreliable bridgehead. Intelligence, however, hoped that the Italian partisans could slow down the transfer of German reinforcements from the north, but Bedell secretly admitted that Eisenhower did not particularly rely on their help. A guerrilla movement comes from the heart. Only a steadfast national leader, the epitome of a symbol of moral regeneration, could overcome the Italian people's antipathy to war. Only after experiencing the atrocities of the German occupation did the Italians rise up against the Germans under the leadership of local leaders. It was only then that the unfortunate Italian people began the long road to return to the community of their neighbours. Eisenhower characterized the tragedy of Italy better than anyone else in his account of the campaign. "For 3 years we have endeavoured to break the spirit of the Italians," he wrote. "We even overdid it." The next day, 9 September 1943, Keane, Hansen and I flew in a twin-engine cargo plane from Algeria to Marrakesh in French Morocco. Marrakesh was then the starting point of the Transport Air Command's air communications line from Morocco to England. A C-54 transport aircraft was scheduled to depart Marrakesh for England across the ocean that evening on a route of 2,800 kilometres. The flight took place at night on a zigzag course at a great distance from the coast to avoid enemy fighters operating from the coast of occupied France. The dispatcher checking luggage glimpsed my general's stars. He glanced around, then whispered to me over the counter, "After all, this is a cargo plane, General, and the flight will last 9 hours. Wait until tomorrow. We'll get you a seat on a fine aeroplane coming from the United States." "No, thank you," I said, "but I'm in a hurry. Besides, this plane will be no worse than a jeep at the front." Travelling in a cargo plane didn't bother me, as I was already hardened enough from the months I had spent in the field. The third star on my epaulettes made me a very important person, and we were invited to dinner at the Taylor Villa, the beautiful winter residence of a wealthy New Yorker, built in the style of the palaces described in Arabian tales. Here, in a green-coloured tiled bathtub embedded in the floor, I had my first warm bath since leaving for Sicily. On our return to the aerodrome, we found that the front part of the cabin of our aeroplane had been partitioned off and converted into a temporary ward for a wounded British general. This was Major General Percy Horrocks, who had commanded for a long time a corps in Montgomery's 8th Army. He had been wounded by a piece of anti-aircraft shell shrapnel during a night bombardment of Bizerti on the eve of the invasion of Sicily. Despite being seriously wounded, Horrocks later returned to action as a corps commander in Europe. The C-54 aircraft stood all day under the African sun, and it was very stuffy inside. However, an hour after taking off from Marrakech at an altitude of about 4,000 meters, we felt like we were in a refrigerator. Most of the other passengers were pilots returning to England after a shuttle bombing raid. The plane hadn't had time to get airborne yet, and they were already making their way to the metal floor to get a good night's sleep before arriving in England. I made myself comfortable in the 3 reclining seats, covered myself with my overcoat and soon fell asleep. I awoke at dawn, stiff and with stiff members, eagerly awaiting the appearance of the coast of England. As we turned from the Atlantic towards Scotland, the bright green masses of Ireland glimmered beneath us. The invigorating sea air did us good as we crossed the Irish Sea. Then the aircraft made a turn over a golf course, and we landed at the huge Transport Air Command base at Prestwick. Here we were met by an American major, a cavalryman in boots. He had heard of the actions of our cavalrymen in Sicily and questioned me for a few minutes, hoping that the army still had cavalry boots and saddles. However, his illusions were quickly dispelled when I told him it was about pack mules. He immediately retaliated by offering us a meagre English breakfast. The waitress, a stocky Scottish girl who spoke with a strong accent, offered me a choice of 2 dishes, the names of which I did not understand. "Let's have the second one," I replied nonchalantly. She returned with stewed tomatoes. The first course was boiled fish. Prestwick taught me to eat breakfast in the future only in American military canteens. While we were waiting for a connecting plane to London, the American ambassador to Russia, Averil Harriman, landed in Prestwick in a special plane. He invited us to fly with him, and 2 hours later, breaking through the clouds, we saw a network of barrage balloons surrounding London. Devers travelled by car to Henley to meet us. He had studied with Patton at West Point in 1909. Only 4 months earlier, General Marshall had appointed Devers commander of the European Theatre of Operations. The first commander in that theatre was Eisenhower. He had arrived in England in June 1942 with the rank of Major General. With the beginning of the invasion of North Africa in November 1942, Eisenhower went to Algeria as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in that theatre. But for several more months, he simultaneously served as the American commander in the European Theatre of Operations. By January 1943, however, North Africa and Europe had become competing theatres of war, and Eisenhower could no longer be torn between the 2 different theatres. The War Department finally put an end to this state of affairs by appointing Air Force Lieutenant General Frank Andrews as commander in the European theatre. Andrews' appointment emphasized the growing importance of our air offensive against Germany in 1943. 4 months later, Andrews was killed. The plane he was flying attempted an instrument landing in Iceland and crashed into a mountain. General Marshall appointed Devers as Andrews' successor. Like Eisenhower, myself, and most of the senior commanders, Devers owed his appointment to the impression he had made on Marshall earlier in his army service. In 1940, General Marshall was going through a list of colonels to select candidates for generalships, broke with established procedure, and selected 2 promising officers to be promoted to extraordinary general ranks. One was Courtney Hodges, then a 53-year-old colonel. The other was Jackie Devers, just a year younger than the former. At this time, Eisenhower and I were lieutenant colonels and considered too young even for the position of regimental commander. 6 months later, Devers was promoted to Major General and sent to Fort Bragg as commander of the 9th Division. There he was ordered to expand the facilities to accommodate another National Guard division. Devers took up the task with such zeal that he soon became known in Washington as a very energetic young officer. I met Devers at West Point back in 1912, in my 2nd year of training. At that time, Devers was assigned to the school as a tactics instructor, and at the same time was in charge of the baseball team. For 3 years, I played on his team. After Devers became the senior American commander in the European Theatre of Operations, he was given important tasks. His duties included not only concentrating troops and amassing armaments in England for the invasion across the Channel, but he also oversaw, on behalf of the Chiefs of Staff Committee, the planning with the British for the invasion of France. The most important questions, of course, were resolved in Washington, but in dealing with the hundreds of less important issues that made up the invasion plan, Devers was charged with making sure that American interests were not compromised. When, in August 1943, Morgan, as Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, presented the Channel Invasion Project to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, his mission was accomplished. Morgan concluded that the invasion could be launched in 1944, even with the meagre resources allocated to the task. To prove his point, Morgan presented an outline of a plan. The codename Overlord was coined by such a master of eloquence as W. Churchill. At this stage, however, Operation Overlord was only a schematic outline. Morgan outlined the areas of the coast for landing, carefully studied the capacity of ports, determined the required tonnage and possible enemy resistance. On the basis of these data, Morgan drew up an outline plan for the invasion. However, our difficulties were just beginning. It took us another 9 months to draw up a detailed plan. According to the plan of Operation Overlord, compiled by Morgan, in the first echelon landed only 3 divisions. 1 American division landed on the right and 2 British divisions landed on the left. All 3 divisions constituted a field army led by the British commander. Later, when landing on the American bridgehead, other divisions from them formed a field army led by the American commander. At the same time, the English headquarters of the Army Group was organized to lead both armies. This headquarters was to direct ground operations until the occupation of the Brittany Peninsula or until the deployment of the American Army Group in France. In other words, the British intended to exercise unrestricted tactical leadership of American troops, both in the invasion across the Channel and in the first few months of fighting in France. The American headquarters of Devers, housed in the red brick building No. 20 in Grosvenor Square, flatly rejected the Cossack proposal. It was at this moment of intense struggle for the leadership of the troops in the invasion across the Channel that I arrived in London. Shortly before my arrival, Devers had endeavoured to break the deadlock by putting forward his plan. He proposed that the divisions of the 1st Echelon, commanded by the headquarters of the British and American Corps, reporting directly to the Supreme Commander. However, this was practically unfeasible, because Devers excluded such a basic link as the army in charge of logistics of troops. In addition, Cossack cited the fact that the Commander-in-Chief would be physically unable to supervise the ground troops during the landing. I was inclined to agree with Cossack's view. When General Marshall informed Eisenhower by radio that I would be in charge of the American army during the invasion, he also indicated that I was charged with the task of deploying the American Army Group to keep up with the British. A field army usually consists of 2 or more corps with 6 or more divisions. In the last few months of the war in Europe, a field army often had 12 to 15 divisions. However, when 2 or more armies were operating on a front, they had to be led by a higher headquarters. That was the role of the Army Group headquarters. By the time we reached the LB, our 12th Army Group consisted of 4 armies combining 10 separate corps of 43 divisions. Although General Marshall had not yet outlined an Army Group commander, he could no longer delay in organizing an Army Group headquarters in the European theatre. If Army and Corps headquarters were developing their invasion plans, the Army Group needed to do its own planning to keep up, while in the US I had to not only brace the headquarters of the First Army, but also to staff the headquarters of the Army Group. This task was not particularly difficult, as it might seem at first glance, because Devers had already selected the chiefs for the intelligence and operational departments and the rear department of the Army Group headquarters. The day before my arrival in England, Devers suggested to General Marshall that he create a US commander's headquarters, similar to Pershing's in World War I. The operations group of the headquarters would become the headquarters of the Army Group. The operations group of the rate would become the headquarters of American field forces under the direct command of the Supreme Commander. The 2nd Echelon of the stake would consist of the home front services. General Marshall immediately rejected this plan. Not only was he anxious to avoid duplication in the operational and administrative organs of headquarters, but he wanted to place them as far apart as possible. Perhaps because he sensed in Devers's proposal to hide in the bowels of the headquarters of American troops in the European Theatre of Operations headquarters of the Army Group, Marshall went even further. He proposed to make the 2 headquarters completely independent. "I want," he wrote to Devers in late September, "that the organization of the headquarters of the Army Group directly led Bradley under your supervision, and that this headquarters would not become only a branch or an appendage of the headquarters of American troops in the European Theatre of Operations." Having been granted autonomy, the expanding headquarters of the 1st American Army Group rolled up its maps and moved to a new residence in Brinston Square, taking up a row of flats in the West End 2 blocks from Marble Arch. Although I had only a couple of days to stay in England before leaving for the United States, Devers insisted that I make my way to Bristol to see if that city was suitable for the 1st Army headquarters. The American headquarters in the European theatre had already decided to move the 5th Corps headquarters from this seaport, once a centre of the colonial slave trade, to make room for the 1st Army headquarters. Bristol was not only conveniently located only 3 hours by car from London, but was also strategically important as a gateway to the southwest of England, where American troops preparing for invasion were concentrated. From here, the troops could load into ports on the southwest coast of England without difficulty. It was my first time in England, and I was pleased to take a tourist walk along the London to Bristol Road, which I later travelled so often. From the Dorchester Hotel in London's fashionable West End, we turned through Hyde Park, drove past the Albert Hall and headed through the crowded streets of Hammersmith on the occasion of Saturday. There were queues of housewives with cards in their hands, waiting patiently for the shop to open in front of boarded-up shop windows. Occasionally there were ruins among the soot-stained houses, testimony to the efforts of the German Air Force 3 years ago. The headquarters of the 5th Corps was housed in the Gothic-style building of Clifton College. In front of the facade of this closed secondary school for boys stood a statue of Field Marshal Earl Douglas Haig, facing the rugby field. Until August 1943, the 5th Corps was in England as the only tactical outpost in a sea of administrative services. The Corps had only one division in its ranks since that time. In addition to the 29th Infantry Division, the 3rd Armoured Division from the United States and the 5th Infantry Division from Iceland had been moved to England. By Christmas 1943, the number of divisions in England had increased from 3 to 10, and by the time the invasion began, there were already 20 American divisions in England. The 5th Corps was commanded by Major General Leonard Guerreau, a close friend of Eisenhower's from the days when they were both lieutenants. I first met Guerreau, a promising young officer, in 1925. We were both students at the infantry school. The 5th Corps, which at the time was the largest American unit in England, was already slated for Operation Overlord. The 29th Division was to be used in the vanguard of American troops in the Normandy landings, maps of which were hung in Guerreau's operations room. Guerreau's flat consisted of one simply furnished room on the first floor of the old Clifton College administration building. It was directly above his office and telephone calls could be heard in it. "The room is fully furnished, Brad," he said. "You may occupy it whenever you wish." "No, thanks, G, but it's not suitable for me," I replied. "The bed is damn close to your desk. I've already been sleeping under the OP for nearly 9 months. Now I'd like to get some peace at least at night." The daily painstaking work of planning in England was a long and arduous process. If I sat up late at my desk, my staff would also consider themselves obliged to work until I went to bed. However, I saw no reason to force the headquarters staff to be exhausted before the fighting began. The next morning at breakfast at Clifton, to which were served eggs borrowed from an American warship stationed in the harbour of Bristol, the bells were rung in the town. Although it was Sunday, the officers at Guerreau's headquarters looked round in amazement. "The bells are ringing for the first time since 1940, a smiling Guerreau explained to me. "The bells are ringing to signal the German invasion of England, but today they are ringing to mark the surrender of Italy." It was somehow hard for me to imagine that only a week ago we were sitting with Eisenhower in Carthage and speculating about what position Badoglio would take. That same evening on our return to London, Hansen and I strolled through Hyde Park, eager to get to know the British better. On the platform at Marble Arch, the traditional venue for street speakers, several people were trying to attract the attention of Londoners strolling by. An elderly Englishman of pleasant appearance was addressing his listeners to demand that England open a second front. A grey-haired gentleman standing at the edge of the crowd raised his cane. "Nonsense," he said, turning to the speaker. "Why don't you mind your own business and leave strategy to military experts?" "Experts, you say?" replied the woman. "And who are you yourself that you speak of experts?" The gentleman shook his head and replied cold. "Madam, you will oblige me very much if you get the hell out of here." The crowd clamoured, and the speaker called it to order. "I would like to remind you, dear friends," he said, "that matters of strategy are handled by the War Cabinet, and the War Cabinet was set up by the people's representatives in Parliament, so any decision on strategic matters in this war is rightfully yours." I thought how poorly he had imagined what a second front was, how much labour it takes to open one. Less than 5 blocks away, in a brick building in Grosvenor Square, the second front was already plotted on top-secret maps. The first group of officers from the 1st Army headquarters, stationed at Governor's Island in New York, had arrived in London a few days earlier to prepare premises for their headquarters. The officers had expected that I would take the entire headquarters of the 1st Army from the United States, and were extremely disappointed when they learnt that I had brought with me some officers from the headquarters of the 2nd Corps. Of the 4 principal positions on the General Staff, 2 were reserved for veterans of the 2nd Corps. Monk Dixon I intended to appoint as Chief of Intelligence and Wilson as Chief of Rear Guard. Of the 18 positions of Chiefs of Departments and Services of the special part of the headquarters, 9 were reserved for officers of the 2nd Corps. For the post of Chief of Operations of the 1st Army I had in mind Colonel Truman Thorson. He had previously served at Fort Benning, then at the end of the campaign in Sicily came to the Corps. Before the war began, Thorson was one of those officers whom Hodges and I spoke of as forgotten men. The Army had a policy that only officers of outstanding ability were sent to command and staff school. Unfortunately, Thorsen had been under the command of a commander for 3 years, who did not even allow the thought of the existence of more outstanding officers than him. As a result, Thorsen was unable to get on the course at Leavenworth. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, he had on his hands an order of appointment to some minor position. Since Thorsen had previously been involved in drawing up a Georgia state emergency defense plan, I asked the War Department to rescind his transfer order and keep him with me to assist in drawing up a defense plan for key installations in the state. Thorsen was so successful in his task that when I became commander of the 82nd Division, I took him on as my chief of logistics. Then, after I transferred to the 28th Division, I appointed Thorsen regimental commander, which resulted in his promotion to colonel. The soldiers loved him and nicknamed him Hard Rock Devil. In his position as regimental commander, Thorsen again proved himself to be an extremely capable man, which made him later a valued officer on the 1st Army staff. My successful discovery of Thorsen illustrates how sometimes the careers of even the most distinguished officers depend on chance. Thorsen was given the temporary rank of Brigadier General when he became Chief of Operations at 1st Army Headquarters, a rank that became permanent at the end of the war. As Chief of Staff Personnel Division, I outlined Colonel Joseph O'Hare, who held the same post at 1st Army Headquarters on Governor's Island. O'Hare, a large, red-haired Irishman, I had known as a cadet at West Point when we played football together. After graduation, we served together for several years at West Point, where O'Hare taught French and coached the football team. Although O'Hare was unnecessarily harsh in his service relationships, he proved himself to be an exceptionally competent personnel chief. Holding this post first in the 1st Army and then in the Army Group, he always acted decisively and straightforwardly. "They think the Chief of Personnel is a son of a bitch," O once said, and I'm going to prove them right. O may have been a son of a bitch to some, but from my point of view he was one of the most capable officers on the staff. When, during the winter campaign, the Chief of Personnel of the Supply Services Staff, headed by Lieutenant General Lee, confused the issue of troop resupply, it was none other than Hare who sorted out the confusion, put the matter before the proper authorities in Washington, and finally straightened things out. We spent the end of the week in Bristol, then headed for Prestwick to leave for the United States from there. I took Red with me to assist me in manning the headquarters of the 1st Army. We had breakfast in Prestwick and lunch in Iceland at the famous Hotel de Gink. That same evening, our C-54 aircraft lifted off from the island to proceed to Presqui Isle, Maine. We were escorted by a squadron of P-38 aircraft. When the island was left behind and the squadron left us, the pilot suddenly made a turn and put the machine on a reverse course. It turned out that the technician had forgotten to close the tank in the right wing of the aircraft, and the petrol flowed from there. While our plane was being refueled in a car park in Maine, we had a hurried breakfast of ham, eggs, and apple pie. 4 hours later we landed in Washington, D.C. On the way we stopped in New York for customs inspection. The young secretary to the Chief of General Staff, the brilliant Colonel Frank McCarthy, announced my arrival to my wife and daughter, who were waiting for me at the aerodrome. Elizabeth had just started her senior year at Vassar, and my wife had taken up residence at West Point at the Thayer Hotel until Elizabeth's graduation. Elizabeth was meeting her mother at West Point, where she was spending her free time with a fellow cadet whom she was going to marry the following June. I introduced myself at the Pentagon and then ate an entire quart of ice cream. I spent most of my brief 2-week stay in the United States at the Pentagon recruiting personnel. We had no trouble finding the right officers. The difficulty came when the question of releasing them from duty was raised, as a consequence of the fact that by September 1943, the Army and Air Force had grown to over 7 million men. Far more good officers were needed than were available. To my rescue came O'Hare. He knew better than anyone else all the secret ways a good personnel chief could use. In the end, he managed to get most of the men I needed. I had to wait almost a week for an appointment with General Marshall. Marshall could not receive me at the ministry due to extreme busyness, and so invited me to accompany him to Omaha, where he was to address the National Convention of the American Legion. During the flight in Marshall's personal plane, we discussed the campaign in Sicily, and I was again struck by how Marshall knew all the details of the operation on that island. However, no word was said about further plans, and I refrained from asking questions. I could find out through the Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander and through the usual chain of command. Marshall was accompanied by another general who had come to the United States on a business trip, and that was Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner. He had just returned from Alaska and was about to head for the Pacific. I saw Buckner on the Marshall Plain for the last time on 18 June 1945. He was killed by a Japanese shell on the island of Okinawa. One afternoon, as I sat in the Pentagon going over the colonel lists, I received a call from Colonel McCarthy of the Office of the Chief of Staff. "The White House is asking if you could be there tomorrow morning. The President would like to hear your report on the campaign in Sicily." That was my first and last conversation with Roosevelt. I wasn't sure whether a soldier should salute his commander-in-chief, so I cheered myself up and entered the office. The President greeted me from behind his desk and gestured for me to sit down. His large head and massive shoulders towered above the clutter of knickknacks on the desk. I'd already been informed that the President was particularly interested in how our soldiers had become battle-hardened. My report was brief and dealt only with the case. The President listened to me attentively, showing an excellent understanding of military matters. Before I could figure out how it happened, the President switched roles with me, initiating me into some of the issues. He told me that America's scientific forces were being mobilized for an ambitious project, the liberation of the energy of the atom. He believed that a weapon would be invented that would completely revolutionize the conduct of war. The President called this weapon the atomic bomb. However, he feared at the time that the Germans might be ahead of us in developing the atomic bomb. Intelligence reported that the Germans were working in this direction in Trondheim in Norway, where the enemy was producing heavy water. The President wanted to acquaint me with our plans, in case the Germans used atomic weapons when the Allied forces landed in France. After a few minutes, I was escorted out of his oval-shaped office, past the correspondents in the room. None of them knew me by sight, and I slipped in unnoticed. A brief message at the White House was all I heard about the atomic bomb until I returned to the United States a month after defeating Germany. I don't remember Eisenhower ever talking to me about it during the entire war. On 2 visits to our front in Europe, General Marshall never even hinted at what was being done at home. Of course, in the 20s and 30s, many military men talked about the need to invent a stronger explosive than trinitrotoluene. Scientists created samples of new explosives, but they were usually too unstable for military use. Meanwhile, military technology was making huge strides. The development of strategic aviation changed the entire course of the war. Despite this, we used the same explosives that had been used in the First World War. All our efforts had been limited to increasing the weight of shells and the range of our artillery. Now the atom had to fill the gap. I spent the end of the week at West Point, was busy all day at Governor's Island, and in the evening watched the Oklahoma in New York. I then returned to Washington to finish selecting officers for major positions both at Army Headquarters and Army Group Headquarters. My choice for appointment as Chief of Staff of Army Group Headquarters fell on Levin Allen, a lean, highly capable staff officer. He succeeded in increasing the capacity of the infantry school to such an extent that by September 1943 it was producing almost 200 second lieutenants a day. In contrast to Keane, characterized by a stern character and carefully considered every step, Allen had an affable and relaxed manner of dealing with people. However, they were both competent officers in their field and were best suited to work in their staffs, sharply different in the nature of their activities. Work in the headquarters of the First Army was more tense and hectic than in the headquarters of the group of armies. Moreover, the officers of the headquarters of the First Army were, although energetic, but irritable and extremely nervous people. This was not reflected in the work of the headquarters itself, for officers drawn from the Second Corps had been severely tested during the Tunisia campaign. However, the Second Corps veterans at First Army HQ had not forgotten the arrogant treatment by the Seventh Army during the Sicily campaign. As a result, the First Army was critical in its relations with the headquarters of other armies, and especially with higher headquarters, and did not recognize any authority other than itself. As if instinctively, the headquarters of the First Army closed in its shell, treating all outsiders as upstarts, interfering in the wrong business. However, as much as I was annoyed with First Army HQ while I was Army Group Commander, I never knew a better and more dedicated HQ than the one with which I took part in the invasion of Normandy. There was much less tension in the Army Group Headquarters than in the First Army Headquarters. Army Group Headquarters seemed developed, lethargic, and unencumbered by any worries, except for occasional skirmishes with Monty. Although the Army Group Headquarters was not as active as the First Army Headquarters, it was no less efficient. I was anxious to start planning the invasion as soon as possible. On 1 October, I left Washington for England in a C-54 from Washington, D.C., on the Great Northern route established for the winter. Before beginning to develop Operation Overlord, I had secured flats in both London and Bristol, as it was difficult to determine how much time I would have to spend at 1st Army Headquarters and how much at Army Group Headquarters, since the headquarters of the American forces in the European theatre, the headquarters of the Supreme Allied Commander and the headquarters of the 21st Army Group were stationed in London. It was important at first that my residence be close to them. I therefore decided to be in London for the first half of the week and Bristol for the second half and Sunday. I attached Bridge to Army Group Headquarters and Hansen to 1st Army Headquarters. Fortunately, the 1st Army would only come under the operational command of the Army Group after the Army Group Headquarters had been moved to France. Otherwise, I would have had to command myself. Nevertheless, telegrams were sometimes received to the commander of the 1st Army Bradley, signed by the commander of the 1st Army Group Bradley. 1st Army Group, in order to deceive the Germans during the invasion, was later renamed 12th Army Group. In London, I was accommodated at the Dorchester Hotel, a fine building in the West End, located off Hyde Park. Not only was the hotel close to the American military canteen, but it was only a 10-minute quick walk from Army Group Headquarters in Brinston Square. I must inform you, sir," said the quartermaster officer, "that the roof of the Dorchester Hotel has been reinforced. Only a large bomb could penetrate it. I have often thought of this while lying quietly in bed during the winter night raids of the German Air Force." Officers from 2nd Corps headquarters had just arrived by plane in Bristol with yellow faces from taking tablets of atabrine, which was issued to troops in the Mediterranean theatre of war as a prophylactic against malaria. 3 weeks earlier, I had also arrived in England yellow as a pumpkin. On my last night in Sicily, Keane cheerfully drank with me for taking his last tablet of atabrine. The next morning he admitted that his toast had been premature. The pills were to be taken for another 6 weeks after leaving the theatre of operations in the Mediterranean. The 5th Corps HQ had requisitioned a house for me behind a ridge of Bristol chalk hills. The building was large enough to accommodate the main staff officers and adjutants. It was an English manor house with a dance hall, greenhouses and stables. We were told that the house was intended to house girls who were difficult to educate. When the first American Army truck drove into the manor's yard, the neighbours breathed a sigh of relief. While the manor house was being prepared for our accommodation, Keane and I were temporarily stationed at Bristol's fashionable Grand Hotel in the old part of town. When we went to the desk to check in, the clerk in charge of room assignments waved his hands in the air. "I'm sorry, gentlemen," he said, "but we honestly don't have a single room available. As you know, there are a lot of English tourists in Bristol." The impasse was only broken after a call from Colonel Gidley Kitchen, the Bristol Military District Commander, who rushed to our rescue. As I signed in the arrivals book, the clerk put his paperweight down and looked at me. "I hope, sir," he said, "that you will not be long with us." I also hoped so. I was in a hurry to cross the Channel and find out what awaited us on the other side of the Channel, to trace from the beginning our preparations for the invasion across the Channel. It is necessary to go back to what happened at midnight on 2 June 1940. That night an English Major General was making his way in a small boat between the wrecks of wrecked ships off the coast of Dunkirk. In the light of the fires created by German air raids, he looked to see if there were any Allied soldiers left in the harbour and on the coast waiting to be loaded. After ascertaining that there were no soldiers left there, Major General Harold Alexander, commander of the 1st British Division, ordered the ship's captain to set a course for England. Alexander was the last of more than 335,000 Allied soldiers evacuated from the continent at Dunkirk to England. 2 days earlier, the commander of another British division had loaded his soldiers on the North Sea coast onto ships and made the perilous journey to England. He was the third son of the Bishop of the Anglican Church on the island of Tasmania, and his name was Bernard Law Montgomery. Overrun by a swift German breakthrough and the surrender of King Leopold of Belgium, the British Expeditionary Corps of 255,000 men was in the bag on the North Sea coast. The British Navy, with the help of other improvised means, managed to ensure that the British Expeditionary Corps was loaded onto ships and delivered to England just hours before the German troops reached the coast. When up the Thames in disarray went ships with tired, hungry and downhearted British troops, abandoned in France weapons and equipment and lost almost all hope for the future. The war seemed already lost just 9 months after its beginning. However, when the German army reached the Channel coast, it turned out that it surpassed the most daring hopes of their staffs. The German High Command had not foreseen that the need to force the Channel could arise so soon, and this was one of the major miscalculations of the Germans during the war. They expected that after the fall of France, England would also withdraw from the war, and therefore did not prepare landing craft to cross the Channel. Perhaps more than anything else, this miscalculation doomed Germany to defeat. Not wishing to expose themselves to the risks associated with the invasion of England, which had a powerful navy, the Germans decided to preliminarily weaken England air bombardment. For 4 years, the German army tramped along the coast until it went from hunter to game. Just as the battle for England was the battle for the English Channel, so the battle for Germany had to begin with the mastery of the Channel. From the moment Alexander evacuated Dunkirk, forcing the Channel became an inevitable prerequisite for Allied victory in the West. Even after the British Air Force repelled heavy German airstrikes during the difficult summer and autumn of 1940, it was hard to see how England could stand up to superior enemy forces. Germany had seized the Atlantic coast from Narvik in Norway to the Paris in Spain, with the capture of French ports in Brittany. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz brought German submarine bases close to England's sea communications. Allied losses at sea increased disastrously until by the end of 1940 they exceeded 5 million tons. Although England entered the war with a large surface fleet which eventually saved her, she could not make up for the losses in ships that threatened to paralyze her shipping. Germany supplied her huge war machine with manpower, food and other supplies from the occupied countries of Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Holland, Luxembourg, Belgium and France. Beyond the cordon of the invaded countries, Germany was expanding its war industry as it prepared to resume its offensive. By 1941, German aircraft production had increased to 12,000 per year compared to 8,000 at the beginning of the war. During the same period, tank production rose from less than 1,000 to more than 3,600 vehicles per year. The air battle over England helped to awaken our people, who realized the impending danger. On 31 August 1940, the National Guard was called into federal service. 2 weeks later, Congress approved the first U.S. preparations for war. During this critical year of 1940, I served on General Marshall's staff with the rank of lieutenant colonel. I saw how patiently he pushed Congress, trying step by step to increase the army from 191,000 men in 1939 to the size authorized for 1940, to 280,000 men. On 1 September, when General Marshall took the oath of office, assuming the position of Chief of the Army General Staff, Hitler's forces concentrated to attack Poland. Despite the meager military capabilities of the United States in the autumn of 1940, American observers in England concluded that, should we enter the war, Germany should have been defeated first. Germany was not only the instigator of aggression on a world scale, but, having mastered what she had conquered, she alone would be in a position to deliver us into stalemate or even defeat us. In the Pacific, too, Japan was becoming more belligerent year by year, but she could damage us but could not destroy us. In early 1941, as the first contingents of conscripts began to be stationed in undeveloped United States military camps, British and American military leaders held a secret meeting in Washington for the first time. As a result of these consultations, a body known as the Joint Chiefs of Staff was established in 1942. It consisted of the commanders of both British and United States military branches, including the unofficial Chief of Staff under Roosevelt, Navy Admiral William Lehigh. The Joint Chiefs of Staff became the governing military body of the Allies, although individual members of the committee continued to report directly to their respective commanders-in-chief. The committee as a whole reported to both Roosevelt and Churchill. The creation of such a body was very useful, as it not only achieved unity of command, but also eliminated the danger of infringement of the interests of both sides. At the Joint Committee meetings in Washington in February and March 1941, the military leaders of England and the United States agreed for the first time that if the United States was drawn into the war, the first blow should be struck at Germany. On 22 June 1941, Germany attacked Russia. Meanwhile, England's position had deteriorated. In North Africa, the Nazi armies threatened to break through Egypt into the strategically important oil-producing areas of the Middle East. The insolent Japanese forced England to transfer additional troops to Hong Kong and Malaya, although England itself was under threat of invasion by German troops. German submarines began to hunt even harder at England's vital communications in the North Atlantic Ocean, until at the end of 1941 Allied losses at sea exceeded 9.5 million tons. By this time, Admiral Dönitz had increased the number of submarines to 3 times what Germany had before the war. Although England had drawn up a plan to force the Channel as early as 1941, it was fantastically premature. The 8 divisions that England had scraped together to defend the metropolis were too few compared to the might of the German army. Hitler had thrown at least 165 divisions against Russia, but another 63 divisions remained in occupied Europe. With such meagre resources, England had nothing else to do but to pin all her hopes on the exhaustion of Germany. If Germany could not be defeated militarily, then it was possible to try to strangle her economically, hoping for her collapse from within. If this had been achieved in 1918, the British reasoned, could it not be done again? Thus, from the autumn of 1941, England began to base its dreams of defeating Germany on a very shaky foundation, hoping that it could be crushed by a naval blockade, aerial bombardment of industrial facilities, the growth of resistance in the occupied countries. But the most important thing England hoped for was the exhaustion of Germany in a war with Russia. General Marshall sympathized with the British and understood their difficulties, which forced them to apply the strategy of exhausting Germany. However, as early as September 1941, he told the British Chiefs of Staff that the war could not be won by waiting alone. Germany could not be defeated by any roundabout means other than offensive action. To suppress the offensive power of Germany, said Marshall, it is necessary to fight with the German army and destroy it in open battle. In the mouth of General Marshall, these words sounded in 1941 boldly, despite the huge military potential, which was at this time in the process of mobilization. England could not yet rely on these vast resources until they were at her disposal. The situation dictated that her strategy should be based on the resources that were available. On 7 December 1941, and the United States was drawn into the war, so suddenly, and the consequences were so catastrophic as a result of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that it was necessary to abandon almost entirely our strategic designs to defeat Germany first. The Navy suffered considerable losses and could hardly secure sea communications. By 7 December 1941, that is 15 months after the announcement of mobilization, the army had grown to 1.7 million men, or 36 divisions, but only a few of them were ready for combat. And although the Air Force had grown to 270,000 men, it was still not out of its diapers. Now that the United States was actively engaged in the war, the considerations of the Joint Chiefs of Staff could be translated into a real strategic plan. Almost immediately following the U.S. entry into the war, Churchill and his military staff traveled to Washington to pool their resources with ours. In agreeing to pursue a strategy designed to defeat Germany first, British and American planning officials were guided by the old military rule of concentrating forces in a decisive direction. Firstly, the defeat of Germany would make it much more difficult for Japan to continue the war, and secondly, the Allies could use their combined forces for an offensive only against Germany. Neither Britain nor Russia could remove troops from their borders to fight the Japanese in the Pacific. If Japan became the first priority for Allied retaliation, then the United States would have to take an offensive against it alone. At the same time, Germany was in Europe in a vice between the Allied powers. Both England and Russia could defend themselves by launching an offensive against Germany. To all these considerations may be added one more, the most important. In order that Russia may be able to resist Germany as our ally, we must give her immediate assistance. Such assistance was understood to mean the diversion of German troops from the Russian front, which could only be achieved by opening a second front. During the hard winter of 1941, fortune finally smiled upon us. At the gates of Moscow, when the German armies seemed destined to triumph, the harsh Russian winter suddenly paralyzed the German war machine. Once again, as at Dunkirk, Hitler's high command paid dearly for not having made comprehensive preparations. The elaborate war plans for Russia did not adequately take into account the severe cold in its vastness. When the Red Army stopped retreating and burrowed into the ground, the Germans suddenly found themselves in a dangerous position in the icy expanse of Russia. To make matters worse, Partisans were attacking vulnerable German army communications. Under these conditions, the Germans began a strategic retreat to hold out until spring. So on Christmas Day 1941, the Russians suddenly became the key to Allied strategy for the next 2 years. It was most important that Russia continue the war, for nowhere else could Germany be so weakened as on the Eastern Front, thanks to the German army's retreat from Moscow. The Allies almost miraculously overcame the second dangerous crisis of the war. Almost from the first day the United States entered the war, our staffs began to study the only possible path that would lead to a skirmish with the German army. As difficult as the task of forcing the Channel was, it had to be accomplished. After all, until the landing in France, we could not begin the offensive on the Ruhr and Berlin. At the same time, due to the approach of the Allied armies to the German border from the west, Hitler would inevitably weaken his troops on the Eastern Front. No other Allied course of action could have produced such decisive results. However, American strategists foresaw the need for careful and lengthy planning of the invasion operation across the Channel. They had to find out what significance for the success of the invasion across the Channel will have every step we take, every ton of cargo. All Allied activities in other parts of the globe had to be subordinated to this basic task. At the end of March 1942, President Roosevelt, fearing a British defeat in the Libyan desert, surprised the American chiefs of staff by proposing a temporary postponement of the Channel invasion to permit the use of American troops in Syria, Libya, and even Northwest Africa. General Marshall was extremely astonished, but he realized that it was impossible to reject the president's plan without offering something in return. A week later, he submitted to the White House for consideration the first plan for the invasion across the Channel in 1943. He did not want to divert forces to an adventure in the Mediterranean Sea, which in strategic terms would be purely defensive in nature. The liberation of North Africa would have kept the Mediterranean in Allied hands, but victory in this theatre would not have been decisive. If the Allies had exhausted their forces in the secondary theatres, then they would have had no troops left to mount a major invasion across the Channel. In April 1942, General Marshall travelled to England with Harry Hopkins. He had with him a sketch of a plan for an invasion across the Channel in 1943. To get his plan approved by the British Chiefs of Staff, General Marshall based it on the inexhaustible resources of the United States. If his plan was approved, Marshall said, the United States would concentrate 1 million American troops in England by the spring of 1943. With rare enthusiasm, the British abandoned their reservations about invading across the Channel and themselves began to draw up plans for a joint landing in France. To ensure that the number of American troops that General Marshall had promised to send from the United States would be concentrated in England in 1943, the planners drew up a plan known by the cipher name Bolero. At the time, the draft of the Bolero plan must have seemed more fantastic than real. For General Marshall spoke of moving 1 million American troops to England in 1943, whereas by May 1942 we had delivered only 32,000 men. But while the Allies were preparing for invasion, they faced a more urgent task in 1943, to help Russia hold out during that year. Despite the German retreat near Moscow, no one underestimated Hitler's ability to launch a spring offensive to save Russia, in case it faced disaster as a result of the expected German spring offensive. The Allies developed an emergency contingency plan for invasion across the English Channel in the summer of 1942. The purpose of this operation was to relieve German pressure on the Russian front, and it was to be carried out only if extraordinary circumstances forced it. For with the insignificant forces we had in 1942, we could only count on capturing a bridgehead, hoping that by doing so we would be able to weaken the German pressure on the Russian front. The operation was codenamed Sledgehammer, but it would have been better called Tuckamer. In the time between April and June 1942, when the American and British Chiefs of Staff met again, enthusiasm for Operation Roundup began to wane on both sides of the Atlantic, and General Marshall's return to the United States. British skepticism was renewed, as British strategists were still not fully convinced that an invasion across the Channel was possible. Even in Washington, there were those who objected to the priority that General Marshall had demanded for the Bolero plan in preparing for the invasion of France in 1943. The naval leaders, now fully absorbed in the war in the Pacific, feared that the implementation of the Bolero plan would interfere with their plans to concentrate forces in the Pacific as soon as possible. In the end, it was not Allied timidity, but the actions of the Axis forces that led to the postponement of the invasion across the Channel. On 13 June 1942, Rommel's African Corps defeated British tanks in the Libyan desert and pushed back Imperial troops over the Egyptian border. The British halted and entrenched themselves at the Arab village of El Alain, just 100 kilometers from their powerful naval base at Alexandria. A week later, 30,000 British surrendered to Rommel at Tobruk. Meanwhile, in Russia, Hitler concentrated 75 divisions for a new summer offensive. This time, guided by Hitler's intuition, German troops were not advancing on Moscow, but towards the Donetsk industrial basin and the vast oil regions of the Caucasus. At the time, few British and American military leaders believed that Russia could hold out until the following winter, when frost would once again become its strongest ally. Like the German generals, these officers did not take into account the vast resources Russia had concentrated in the Urals region. If by some miracle Russia managed to hold out in the summer of 1942, they believed, then it would be able to resist further. However, it was realized that if the Nazis managed to break through Egypt, they would cut the Suez Canal and drive the British out of the oil-rich areas of the Middle East. A British defeat in Egypt would set the stage for an even grander catastrophe. If Hitler had managed to unite his forces developing offensive in Africa and Russia, he would have realized Napoleon's dream of conquering India and the Middle East through a huge double sweep across the Caucasus and the Arabian Desert. Within 2 months, the Nazis had thwarted Allied plans to launch an invasion across the Channel in 1943. Had the Allies not thrown their few divisions into the fight in 1942, they might have lost the war before the vast resources of the United States were brought to bear. It was in anticipation of such an emergency that the plan for Operation Sledgehammer was devised. But Churchill stood in the way of the implementation of this plan. He rejected the plan Sledgehammer, arguing that it is not appropriate to land a significant force in France if we do not intend to establish a foothold there. The United States could not argue with Churchill, because if the Allies had landed in 1942, the main landing force would have consisted of the British. Moreover, Churchill's opinion was probably justified because with the forces available, the Western Allies could hardly hold a bridgehead in Europe in 1942. If we had landed and then been thrown into the sea by the Germans, the military significance of such an operation would have been more than negated by the disastrous moral impact our failure would have had on the occupied peoples. The most important thing was that the Allies should maintain among the peoples of Europe an unshakable confidence in their liberation. Better that they be liberated at a later date than to completely undermine their faith in our forces. Despite the persuasiveness of Churchill's arguments, Roosevelt insisted that the Allies could not sit idly by until the summer of 1943. When the Prime Minister arrived in Washington on 18 June 1942, he had already prepared a response to Roosevelt, since an invasion across the Channel in 1942 could not take place because of the Allies' lack of resources. Churchill proposed a diversion against the Germans in the Mediterranean to keep Russia in the war. His original plan targeted the French port of Dakar as the target for a strike. However, Dakar was separated from the Mediterranean by an impassable desert and the equally impassable Atlas Mountains. Even worse was the fact that Dakar was located at a distance of 2,500 kilometers by land from Algeria, 3,500 kilometers from Tunisia, and 8,000 kilometers from El Alamein. Since the capture of Dakar did not justify either the risk or the resources required for this purpose, Churchill's plan was replaced by a bolder plan tentatively called Torch. The implementation of Operation Torch led the Allies into North Africa. On the overcast morning of 8 November 1942, British and American troops landed in Algiers, Oran, and Casablanca, carrying out their first major amphibious operation. However, Operation Torch came at a high cost to the Allies. As a result, we were not only forced to abandon Operation Roundup the following year, 1943, but also delayed the invasion across the English Channel until 1944. By undertaking this diversionary operation in the Mediterranean, the Allies were sidetracked from their main strategic objective. It was not until January 1943, when the Joint Chiefs of Staff met at Casablanca, that General Marshall was able to turn his attention to organizing an invasion across the Channel. And even then he was forced to relent and agree to a landing in Sicily, for, having begun operations in the Mediterranean, the British were no longer willing to abandon them. The political advantages of waging war in this theatre of war well compensated for the insufficient military benefits. Having managed to draw us into the war in the Mediterranean, Churchill never ceased to advocate his favourite strategy of striking at the soft underbelly of the Axis powers. As early as September 1942, 2 months before the Allied landings in North Africa, Churchill was plotting further operations in the Mediterranean. At Casablanca, he advocated even more vigorously the continuation of the war in this theatre of operations. General Marshall, however, was so convinced of the strategic necessity of an invasion across the Channel that he remained indifferent to the arguments of the Prime Minister of England. General Marshall's greatest fear was that the British desire to achieve easy victories in the Mediterranean Sea will involve us in a hopeless war. Such waiting by the sea weather, Marshall said, you cannot win the war. The British, while agreeing with General Marshall that strategic planning should be aimed at an invasion across the Channel, still insisted that we should capitalize on our successes in the Mediterranean. They still hoped that small jabs at the flanks of the Axis countries could win the war. In Casablanca, the British demanded that Operation Torch be followed by another operation in the Mediterranean. Although Operation Roundup had not yet been formally cancelled, the diversion of Allied resources to North Africa eliminated any possibility of a successful invasion across the Channel in 1943. The Allied landings in North Africa in November 1942 were followed by a reduction in the number of troops to be transferred from the United States to England. Instead of 1,147,000 men, only 427,000 were sent. Thus, even if the Allies had been able to muster sufficient forces for an invasion in 1943, the Germans would have vastly outnumbered them. As a result, the British had reason to argue that an invasion across the Channel in 1943 would have only a minor effect on the course of land fighting in Europe. By this time, the strategic situation had again changed, and the predicament in which the Allies had found themselves only a few months earlier was no longer the same. In October 1942, the British at El Alamein not only stopped Rommel's advance into the Middle East, but Montgomery himself unexpectedly launched a counter-offensive. By January 1943, when the Joint Chiefs of Staff met in Casablanca, Montgomery's 8th Army had recaptured more than 2,250 kilometers of North African coastline, defeating Nazi forces and approaching Tripoli. In Russia, another encompassing strategic grouping of Hitler's Nazi army, which aimed to break through to the Middle East, was destroyed in the Caucasus. The Red Army not only held back the German offensive at Stalingrad, but by defeating the troops of Field Marshal Friedrich von Paulus, finally undermined the faith of the German people in the victory on the Russian front. Given this strategic situation, the British could quite reasonably ask the question at the Casablanca conference. Why risk an invasion of Europe in 1943? It could not produce decisive results. At the same time, would it not bring our troops to the brink of disaster? If the Mediterranean operations have been so successful, why should we abandon them now, when we have nowhere else to put our energies? Indeed, in the summer of 1943, there was no possibility of any operation elsewhere, and General Marshall was forced to agree. As a result, on 14 January 1943, the Joint Chiefs of Staff instructed Eisenhower to invade Sicily at the most favourable period of time, in July. If no offensive had been planned for the summer of 1943, then Allied forces in the Mediterranean theatre of operations would have been idling for an entire summer on the North African coast. Such inactivity would not have won the war. Equally, it would have been of no help to the Russians. Although the Russian army had launched a counter-offensive during the winter, Allied strategists feared that Russia might still make a separate peace with Germany. They insisted on aiding and supporting Russia in the war at all costs. Although an invasion of Sicily would not directly support the Russian front, it nevertheless posed a threat to Italy, and in the event of Italy's collapse, Germany would have to replace the 33 Italian divisions in the Balkans and southern France with its reserve. Of great importance to Allied strategists was also the prospect of saving tonnage of ships as a result of the campaign in Sicily. With the capture of this island, German aviation would be forced to base itself on the Italian boot, and the Mediterranean would become open to Allied convoys heading for the Suez Canal. Such an advantage could not be lightly relinquished in January 1943, for the Allies' lack of naval tonnage severely limited the scope of offensive operations. Since 4 September 1939, when the British liner Athenia was torpedoed by the Germans off the coast of Scotland, Nazi submarines had sunk Allied ships, with a total displacement of more than 17 million tons. This was 1.5 times the total pre-war tonnage of the American merchant fleet and was equivalent to 1,500 Liberty vessels. Meanwhile, despite mounting losses at sea, by the end of 1942 the German submarine fleet had been greatly strengthened with 159 new submarines. The Germans had started the war in 1939 with only 59 submarines. After the surrender in 1945, Admiral Dönitz declared that Germany had lost the Battle of the Atlantic before it had even begun. During the 5.5 years of the war, Germany built 1105 submarines. If Germany had only had half that number of submarines at the start of the war, it could have won the war before we changed the course of the war in its favour, trying to adhere to the Allied strategy aimed at an invasion across the Channel. General Marshall, at the Casablanca Conference, made every effort to obtain from the British a firm assurance of an invasion in 1944. However, the British leaders preferred to skirt the issue and conditioned their agreement on various reservations, whereas General Marshall saw an invasion across the Channel as a means to deliver a decisive blow that would lead to the defeat of the Axis forces. The British wanted to use the invasion only to deliver a final blow only when the Germans were on the verge of exhaustion. Although General Marshall failed to obtain firm assurances at the Casablanca Conference, he nevertheless summed up the basis. He did not think it advisable to plan an invasion of Italy long before the landing in Sicily. Eisenhower was asked to plan a series of such successive operations as would help to bring Italy out of the war. At the same time, the committee was busy clarifying the issues surrounding the invasion across the English Channel. For the operation was allocated 29 divisions, together with reinforcements, with the task of landing and consolidating on a bridgehead from which further offensive operations could be undertaken. A date was even set for the start of the operation, 1 May 1940, to ensure undisputed priority to the invasion across the English Channel. It was planned to transfer in the autumn from the Mediterranean theatre of operations in England 4 American and 3 British divisions, which had already gained combat experience. As a result of the agreement reached in May 1943, the number of American troops concentrated in England, according to the Plan Bolero by the spring of 1944, was increased to 40,000 people. A few months later, this figure rose to 1,460,000 men. When the Joint Chiefs of Staff met again on 8 August 1943, this time in Quebec, it was evident that our war effort in the Mediterranean had produced greater results than we had hoped. Mussolini had been overthrown, Sicily had been almost entirely cleared of Germans, and Italy was showing signs of disintegration. In the same interval, it was decided to invade Italy. In Russia, for the first time, the summer offensive was launched by the Red Army rather than the Germans. Now the Germans began to retreat, and this retreat continued all the way to Berlin. In the Atlantic Ocean, Allied ship losses were reduced after the American Navy threw its convoy carriers and patrol vessels against the wolf packs of German submarines. Even in the distant Pacific, the United States seized the initiative. By this time, the Solomon Islands had been captured and American troops were making their way through the jungles of New Guinea. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, meeting in Quebec, were for the first time not bound by the need for extraordinary military action in Europe. Events that had begun with Operation Torch were now approaching a climax with the collapse of Italy. Henceforth, the offensive in the Mediterranean could no longer be justified by the need to maintain the Allied offensive impulse. Any new operation against the southern part of Europe, whether through southern France or the politically important Balkans, would have required an immediate revelation of the cards as to the strategy of invasion across the Channel. At last, the days of improvisation were over and planning could begin. General Marshall had compromised 3 times in the past in preparation for the Channel invasion. The first compromise resulted in Operation Torch in 1942, the second in the invasion of Sicily, and the third in the invasion of Italy. However, as valuable as these supporting operations in the Mediterranean were, they consumed enormous Allied resources. Clearly, the time for compromise had passed. Any new Allied operations in the Mediterranean could only delay the invasion across the Channel. When American strategists insisted in Quebec that it was necessary to concentrate all efforts on the invasion across the Channel, the British again hesitated. At this conference, the British disagreed with the Americans, demanding planning for current operations as opposed to forward strategic planning, as General Marshall had insisted. The British had to face shortages and crises almost from the first day of the war, so they were forced to conduct operations with limited purpose that improved their position or produced immediate results. In contrast to the British, we entered the war with boundless confidence in the abundance of our almost inexhaustible resources. Thus, while the British showed restraint and caution in planning strategic operations, we were able to concentrate all our forces for one great offensive. When British and American strategists clashed at Quebec on the question of the extent to which our efforts should be subordinated to preparations for an invasion across the Channel, the American position was firm. But the directive produced at the Quebec Conference, categorical in form, was in substance a compromise. Instead of giving unconditional priority to the invasion across the Channel, as General Marshall had insisted, the Joint Chiefs of Staff directive stated the following. Since there are insufficient resources to support Operation Overlord and operations in the Mediterranean Sea, simultaneously, available resources must be allocated with the primary objective of ensuring the success of Operation Overlord. Operations in the Mediterranean Sea will be conducted by those forces outlined by Roosevelt and Churchill at the conference in Washington in May 1943, unless the size of these forces is changed by decision of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The British took advantage of this loophole and dodged again. However, despite the reluctance of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee at Quebec to emphasize clearly in its decisions the need to give unconditional priority to the Channel invasion, the committee essentially undertook to do so by adopting three major agreed decisions in August 1943. In these decisions, the committee approved the outline plan for Operation Overlord submitted by Cossack and directed Morgan to continue planning the operation. 2. Rejected the proposal that the 7 divisions in the Mediterranean theatre intended to take part in the landing in France should be sent to Italy. 3. Proposed that the scope of Operation Overlord be increased from the original Cossack version of the operation. Churchill not only agreed to an increase in the invasion force in France, but, for his part, proposed to strengthen by at least 25% the first echelon of the naval landing force, originally intended to consist of 3 divisions. He also proposed, in order to expand the bridgehead, to organize an additional landing on the eastern coast of the Cotentin Peninsula. This time the Prime Minister was right on the mark, for the 2 main changes later made to the Cossack plan were first, to increase the invasion force by 2 more divisions, and second, to make an additional landing on the Cotentin Peninsula. With the approval of the plan submitted by Cossack, the preparations for Operation Overlord were finally put on a practical footing. It was now difficult to cancel or even slow down the preparations for the operation. Another obstacle remained, for in the autumn the British once again tried to direct our efforts to the Mediterranean Sea. This attempt by the British was thwarted by Stalin at the Tehran Conference